So good morning, everybody. This is Massimo Leone, Director of the Center for Religious Studies at the Bruno Kessler Foundation in Trento. We have the great honor and pleasure to have a lecture today by Professor Katarina Glaab from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and MBU. Professor Glaab is a professor of the Department for International Environment and Development Studies at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and worked at the cluster Religion and Politics at the University of Münster. She also held visiting fellowship positions at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Tsinghua University, Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, and Fridtjof Nansen Institute. She specializes in global environmental politics and the role of norms in international governance. Her intervention is particularly suitable today within this seminar about transformation and conservation in religion and ethics, which is the backbone of our activities this year. So I welcome her talk entitled Sacred Norms and Global Storms, Religion and International Politics of Climate Change. And I'm gonna now share my screen with the presentation of Professor Glaab.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy at least to be able to join you online. It's of course always nicer to be able to talk in person and meet, but maybe there will be chances another time. And as you said, I mean, it's particularly, I didn't realize before accepting the invite and also when we were figuring out the date that this was actually going to be a very essential and big date for climate change politics today, since today, if some of you have followed the news, the United Nations Climate Change Conference has just started. And I think you can already click forward to the UN Climate Change Conference, exactly. So feel free just to do all the pictures already and everything, then you don't have to wait for me to tell you for the next click on the same page. So today the Climate Change Conference has officially started, and it's going to take place in the Amazon, in the heart of the Amazon, in Belém, in Brazil, starting today. And it is an important milestone, of course, for climate change politics, since it's 10 years after the very famous Paris Agreement. But it's also been 10 years since the publication of Laudato Si, as that many of you will know, and about which I'm also going to talk about today a little bit more. And this is the first time that the Amazon will be hosting this climate change conference, and many see this also as one of these very decisive moments where states have to renew global commitments, but at the same time, of course, we're seeing a lot of issues in terms of how the world has changed over the last years, with states backing out of the agreement, but also more and more actors coming in. If you click a little further, you will see that the Climate Change Conference, of course, has a lot of to do with states coming together in order to find agreements, but also about ways of finding ways how to implement the agreement and the politics that we've been coming together for. But at the same time, a lot of other things are happening at these conferences. So outside of the conferences, you will see people demonstrating for climate justice. You also see here pictures of people that have been the so-called pilgrimage for the COP that happened the years before. There's also more other actors, such as the Extinction Rebellion. So there's a lot going on outside of these conference centers, but also all over the world in preparation for these events. And this, of course, is a very interesting place for a political scientist, for me, to see what is actually happening when states and civil society, but also other actors, are coming together to think about the future of the world, but also on which way to tackle climate change. And here's, of course, the focus on these religious actors. So what role do religious actors play in that? And they're what we know is that they're increasingly participating in public debates on the environment and climate change, and particularly the papal encyclical on care for our common home, which focuses primarily on these environmental and also climate policy questions, has been one very prominent example in the last times, to bring about more political discussions as well within the United Nations, but also more civil society action outside these international negotiations at the same time. And this kind of religious participation has also been welcomed on the very highest policy levels. So if you click on the next slide, you see two very prominent faces and voices that have been asking for the participation of faith and religions to take part in global climate politics. So the first one is Cristina Figueres, who used to be the former UNFCCC secretary. And she's asking for faith groups and religious institutions to find their voice and their moral compass on one of the greatest humanitarian issues of our time. And also Ban Ki-moon has been a very prominent person to highlight the role of faith actors and religions in order to tackle that very important question of our times. And this possibility of participation, also this kind of acknowledgement that religion matters in this context, is something that particularly interested me as a political scientist. So these questions of how do religious actors engage in global climate policies, which issues are particularly important to them, how do they potentially differ also from other civil society groups, and what kind of specific contributions can they make to the global climate policy itself. So these are the kind of questions that have been driven me over the last years, and that also I want to discuss with you today. If you go to the next slide. And this is kind of the starting point is, of course, one that is probably very familiar to you. You've been going through the conversation lecture series for some time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this issue. Just to kind of embed it within the broader debate is, of course, the question of the relationship between religion and ecology as such. So the question of are religions green, or maybe are they turning green? And many would have, so you see here the book from John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker, who've been establishing the religion and ecology debate very much, which has been followed up in different disciplines as well, and established this thesis that religions have entered their ecological phase. If you click a little further, we can see that as well. And just to give you like the broader framing of it, I think in terms of how this also matters for our discussions of religion within the international climate negotiations, it's this question of whether we can think about the role of religion between pessimism and rather maybe a green religious optimism. So established with this, the discussion in the very beginning by Lynn White, whether religions are responsible for the environmental crisis and then also hindering environmental action, or whether faith-based values may be able to actually contribute to a more positive, optimistic, and also transformative vision on norms that can be translated into potentially policies, but also into environmental action by the churches and faith groups themselves. This is interesting in that regard, that it also links up to a debate by environmental politics scholars that see religion or the environmental movement, if you click one further, also as a religious quest in itself. And Dunlop has been framing the environmental movement as something that can be seen as a religious quest, and has labeled it itself as a secular faith. And so there's a lot of nuances and contradictions that will come in here that I'm also going to discuss a little bit more, between what does it mean to have somewhat distinct religious norms, if we think about this optimistically as a possibility to contribute to more positive climate action, while at the same time the environmental movement is labeled, or if we believe that or follow that assumption, that it's rather labeled within these more secular terms. So I think that's a very interesting contradiction, and that has been playing out particularly in the debate between climate action and religious actors. If we go to the next slide, I just want to also give you a bit of a basics here around why religions are seen to be relevant to be involved in climate politics. And I think there's a lot of different ways how different scholars would think about why it matters to include religions. In the very beginning, you've seen these statements from political leaders at the UNFCCC and at the UN, which are highlighting different aspects. One very important aspect, I think, is to think about religion as very instrumental. They think about the ways that 8 out of, very often in this context, is exactly that cited, what I'm citing here. The Pew Research Center reports that 8 of 10 people worldwide identify themselves as religious, and therefore there's a possibility or seen to be a very valuable contribution, of course, if you have access to all these people and all of these people would agree that a climate action is needed or more environmentally friendly values are possible to establish, then this would be a very important game changer. At the same time, we're also seeing that these institutional and economic resources that are related to particularly churches are also a way of making a very big contribution. This you can also see in the discussions around the global divestment movement, which is asking, particularly, for instance, the Catholic Church to divest from these more polluting industries. So this is also connected to this discussion in how influence can be established. So if we have all these people that are potentially following a more environmentally friendly ethics, what could potentially happen if all of these also participate and maybe change their world views towards this kind of broader idea. There's also this idea that some of the religious leaders have a more of a moral authority, that people would rather listen to a religious leader than to decision makers in society and politics. And here's just a short quote from an editor of Nature in 2011, who said that if people won't listen to scientists, perhaps they will listen to religious figures of authority. So there's an idea that this form of authority will have more influence potentially than that what scientists have to say. And overall, this is the idea that we cannot just put religions to the side just because they have not been maybe part of the debate for a long time, but that we need to listen to these new forms of mobilization that we're also witnessing, as in the very first pictures that I've shown you, that they're showing up to climate conferences, but also outside in terms of demonstrations. So Mike Hulme, which is the next quote, if you click one further, argued, who's a very famous climate scientist, but also environmental politics scholar, argued that ignoring the role and influence of religion in responses to climate change might be another form of denialism. So we need to listen to all of the voices that are out there in order to also come to a broader understanding of how to reach the goal that we want to reach in climate politics. So if you click one further, here's just the grounding that you see. So here's, of course, the backdrop or the embeddedness within the broader greening of religion debate. When we go back to White from 1967, arguing that although finding that religion is at the roots of environmental problems, but also coming to the maybe somewhat surprising conclusion that the remedy must also be essentially religious, so that there is something around religions that we need to tackle and that can contribute to a changing of these kind of worldviews. And if you click to the next sentence, here is a way, while the first one is maybe more of a quote of how this has been seen in the broader theoretical debate. Here is maybe a more of an empirical observation how this has been transformed also within the climate change negotiations. So this is a submission from the Interfaith Liaison Committee to the COP, so the Conference of the Parties at the Climate Change Conferences 27. And I think here we see a lot of these different statements around why religion matters and how they contribute coming together when they argue that we see that scientific information and statements from political leaders have not succeeded in diverting us from a very dangerous trajectory. Life on Earth, as we know it, is in danger to act against short-termism and economic growth models that do not include the health of the ecosystems. We need new narratives. So a changing of worldviews, a different kind of story that is proposed here. There's also the need, we need to raise the moral obligation to act. So also again, asking for the moral authority or relying on somewhat of a moral authority here. And also bringing in different forms of focus when they ask for the most vulnerable to be protected, and to see that more justice and equity is also brought into the discussions of the climate debate. So we need faith communities to underpin the great transition we must undertake, a just transition for climate justice. So I think this is really bringing together the arguments of these different ways of thinking why religious actors should be included in the global climate change discussion and policy debates, ranging from this very instrumental perspective to the moral, but also changing of worldviews, which this submission is really bringing forward. If you click to the next slide, feel free just to do the entire page already, then you have it there. So again, I want to go back to this argument that we saw in the beginning, that there is somewhat of a religious, potentially religious contribution to climate change policy and discussions, negotiations, but that there is also maybe somewhat of a potential conflict around the secular environment. So I want to address this a little bit more, because I think it's a very defining perspective. So the question that I start with here is that in what kind of context international climate policy and negotiations actually take place. So if we start from the assumption that the United Nations provide these institutional framework for international climate policy, we get a somewhat specific answer. So at first glance, the somewhat controversial secularization theory, claiming that religion plays no significant role in modern societies, and that the public, political, but also the religious spheres are distinct, seem somewhat relevant here. So in research on international organizations, for instance, I would say the separation of religion and politics serves as a quite important analytical heuristic in analyzing the role of religion. So the UN is very often described as a secular organization, as it's based on non-religious values, as Haynes would, for instance, argue. Others, such as Petitz and Dionigi, would argue that the UN is a secular organization, but would also emphasize that it's not somewhat, I think they call it aggressively secular, since the UN is very open to religious actors and their participation in political debates. And I think also, particularly when it comes to climate politics, this kind of assumed separation between religion and politics becomes particularly important. Firstly, because transnational environmental problems are often discussed in these supranational settings, so in these international organizations, which, according also to Peter Berger, are dominated by a secular cosmopolitan elite. And this could lead then also to religious actors having to adapt to the norms and conventions of the United Nations and to this, to the more liberal, or what he defines as non-religious discourses, in order to gain a hearing for the concerns within those organizations itself. Secondly, the scientific and technical considerations play also a particularly prominent role in environmental debates. And because these debates are so technical and scientifically based, the boundaries are often reinforced here again. because there is somewhat of a dichotomy between what we would see as rationalism, reason, and science on the one hand, and then irrationality, emotion, and religion, often associated together on the other side. And in that kind of context, religions could then also be perceived as irrational, ineffective in addressing environmental challenges, and also potentially explains why people like Dunlop would say that many environmentalists say that they feel unfamiliar, but also maybe even uncomfortable using the language of religion in that specific context. And I think this was also somewhat confirmed when I started working, doing my empirical field work within the United Nations conferences, when I was asking other civil society actors about the role of religion in the climate negotiations. And I think the usual response was in the very beginning, oh, there is no religion at the United Nations. It doesn't matter. And that is, of course, an assessment that is somewhat obviously incorrect if we just start with the empirical observation that many religious actors and organizations are actually registered as observers at the United Nations and also have been engaged in environmental issues for decades, and also since the beginning of the United Nations Conference Framework Convention on Climate Change since 1995. So they've been around, and but that kind of reaffirmed at least my initial observation that there's somewhat of a perception that there are boundaries here that are playing out between the secular and the religious, particularly when it comes to climate change negotiations, which also raised this kind of question. So whether and how actually religious actors can actually play a role then in these climate change discussions at all. If you go to the next slide, I think I just want to break down. If we note that religious actors are actually present in this so-called international environment, I think it's important to just see what they are concerned with and who they actually are. So in the context of the United Nations, and particularly in this United Nations framework for the Climate Change Convention, and these days now in Brazil, you will find a lot of different forms of actors. So it can be church and religious associations, like the World Council of Churches, interfaith networks. You will find religious development organizations like Bread for the World, Miserior, Christian Aid, which have been engaged for a long time. You will also find negotiators from religious states, such as from Israel and Saudi Arabia, and of course the Holy See, which holds somewhat of a special role as an observer with legal representation of the Vatican State and also the Roman Catholic Church at the United Nations. So when I was doing my research on religious actors within the Climate Framework Convention, I mainly focused on the civil society variants of religion. And also due to its special role, the Holy See during that time. Another aspect to take into account is that most of the religious actors involved in this process are Christian organizations from the global north. And this relative dominance of Christian groups can be explained very often by a lack of funding that is available to those other groups from the global south, but also traditionally a higher level of organization of Christian groups within the United Nations itself. But I think over the last years, we've seen a higher number or a rising number of non-Christian participants, and also those from the global south. And very often it also depends on where the meetings are taking place, whether it's easier and more accessible for those actors that are often not represented there. Important to note is also that religions and faith groups do not have their own constituency at the United Nations. So the United Nations has a possibility of including non-state actors. Many of these actors have the possibility to go through their constituency. So a constituency can, for instance, be women groups, farmers, indigenous groups, businesses as well, environmental groups, researchers. But religion, somewhat surprisingly, is not in its own distinct group. So they're part of broader civil society, at least at the United Nations. And this also has, like from a political science perspective, of course, somewhat consequences, as they are cannot present statements in the process itself, and they can also not contribute with position papers in the plenary sessions and working groups. And I think the groups have been kind of working within the UN and doing their thing for a long time, somewhat uncoordinated. But over the last years, and you've seen the statement from this group, there's been an interfaith liaison committee founded. This was established around the Warsaw Conference in 2013, and also partly as a request from the UN Secretariat. So it's been seen on both sides, from within the institution and from the religious actors and faith groups themselves, that there is a need to somewhat organize and coordinate better. There's a possibility in there to better show that there is a faith contribution that is very specific and distinct, that can be brought to these kind of this kind of setting. So within this kind of network now, there's a lot of organizations and individuals that working together to strengthen also their joint advocacy and as a religious group, and also to improve their communication among themselves. And they are increasingly better organized now, I would say. But these groups also, because they have a lot of humanitarian and development based orientation, you will also see that a lot of them are working together with the more classic civil society organizations. In this context, it's a Climate Action Network in the UN, but also other groups which are focusing maybe more on human rights, the youth groups, indigenous people. So there's a lot of overlap and also collaboration with these. Yeah, so just to give you like a kind of sense of understanding of the context that we're in. So in the following, I will then talk a bit more about how they actually work and what is important to them. So this is very much based on my a lot of interviews that I've been doing with these religious actors on the faith groups and participating in the UN climate change conferences since 2013, since they were first founded as an interfaith committee. So if you go one slide further. So I think there's a distinction that we can often see of how religious actors are taking part. And these are very mundane things. So very much interested in this kind of the sociology of the institutions itself, the practices and actions that religious actors are having within the climate change conferences. So on the right side, you see a picture from COP26, actually, which has been used again now to ask also many of the members to meet for prayers and meditation for the UN COP30, which is one way that the ILC, so the Interfaith Liaison Committee, has been organizing the work of the network. And then below you see a schedule, what like a week or a usual day would look like from the Loud Out to Sea movement, the youth movement that has been engaging as an observer within UNFCCC, and which has like a lot of very normal, in a way, normal things that other civil society organizations and observers would do as well, registering, meeting with some of the following the streams or the work packages that are they're interested in, but also very specific ones such as the Catholic Actors and the Holy See meeting that they have here. They have the interfaith meeting. So there's a lot that they're organizing around that. And this is, of course, where they're working inside the organization itself, which I've been working on most, but a lot is going on outside as well in terms of demonstrations and that broader global civil society is organizing. So there are a lot of different ways how these faith actors are taking part. So they do a lot of the things that a lot of other actors are doing. They do lobbying, they submit statements, often trying to do that as based on their joint agreement in terms of interfaith statements. They organize joint representation, as in their meetings that you can see also on the side. They cooperate with civil society. A lot of the campaigning that is happening outside is also somewhat going inside of the institution itself. There's also a different way of lobbying, which the Quakers would call quiet diplomacy. So it's these more informal meetings with the negotiators, trying to build ground and sharing of experiences to kind of build a better rapport across different stakeholders. And then you also have the statements of these religious leaders, going back to the question of moral authority, where these leaders somewhat intervene also in the discussion to say, we need more action. So we've often seen with Pope Leo and the economical patriarch Bartolomeo. If you go one slide further. So that's way of the kind of the action part. The other part is then what is actually important to these religious and faith actors. What kind of aspects do they want to highlight, and how are they different from maybe other civil society actors? For a very long time, the Climate Framework Convention was very heavily focused on scientific and technical debates, because there was initially a focus on climate change mitigation, also the so-called meaning that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And only after adaptation, so adjusting to climate change, was introduced as a complementary concept, did also these more ethical questions gain more attention. Because then, of course, other questions come up. And it's in this context that also the climate justice movement emerged, that also religious and faith-based actors are very much speaking to. So they see climate change rather as a product of social inequality, and also as the result of an economic system that is driven by growth, by the growth paradigm itself. And this perspective on climate justice also highlights quite different dimensions of injustice that can result from climate change. So very often you will find international justice, where it's highlighted there's a stark disparity between major polluters and countries that are most affected by climate change. There's also this more intrasocietal justice dimension, which highlights that the poorest are the most severely impacted by that, and the intergenerational injustice aspect, since today's decisions, of course, affect the ability of future generations to lead a good life. More and more other things are also coming up. So we also have discussions around interspecies justice coming in, which are also more and more discussed within that context. I think while climate justice is one aspect that, of course, a lot of organizations would agree on, I think there's a huge division within the Climate Framework Convention itself, what this actually means. And some would also focus more on these more technical and market-based strategies to achieve that goal, while others would emphasize that global justice can only be achieved through systemic change. And one of the biggest differences, of course, emerges also in the debate over the fair distribution of climate-related costs between the global north and the global south. And it's in this context that also the religious actors are kind of finding their place and where they want to situate themselves, and where they see that change is needed. If you go to the next slide, then it's, of course, the discussion if a lot of civil society agrees that climate justice is a very important part of the discussion, where do religious actors situate themselves? Or can we even say that there are distinct religious norms when it comes to climate justice? And And I would say religious actors also occupy various positions in between this kind of contested field itself. So justice is somewhat a connecting element between civil society and religious actors. But I would say their emphasis on ethical aspects also distinguishes them from them very much. So the normative goals of many religious actors centers on the core of sustainable development. So they striving for a good life and the idea of inter and also intragenerational justice. So the desire to enable all people now and in the future to live a dignified life. Religious actors also emphasize more the immaterial dimensions of a good life. So the going a bit beyond the normal 3 dimensions of sustainable development that we would hear from civil society, such as economic, environmental, and social aspects, and somewhat suggests a more holistic perspective here, introducing a moral and ethical dimension in addition to that. And there are, of course, a lot of overlaps with other civil society actors, particularly in this field in climate justice, and where they also feel that there's a possibility to interact. I think what is also important is to see that religious actors themselves see themselves very often as in a role as mediators. So there's a connection between the global level and the international negotiations and the local experiences of climate change in the global level, on the local side. So they're seeing themselves as witnesses of climate change and their unique possibility to bring that very specific place-based knowledge, local knowledge also into the negotiations to the global side to remind them what is actually at stake. So I think that's also a big difference to civil society organizations, which are working transnationally very often, but don't have the possibility to go back to a religious foundation or a community itself in which these experiences are based. So that's one aspect that also is more and more highlighted as a very unique contribution that religious actors can make within those negotiations itself to show not just on a normative and discursive level what justice is about, but also have somewhat evidence of the injustices that climate change is already bringing about today. If you go to the next slide. Here I want to go back a little bit to the discussion in the beginning around the distinctions that we somewhat see, or the possibility that there is somewhat of a conflict playing out between the secular and the religious at those international institutions. If we think back to Habermas, who highlighted that religions have a special power to articulate moral intuitions, especially with regard to vulnerable forms of communal life. So exactly going back to this kind of observation that there's somewhat of a mediator role between for religious actor in this context. He also says that it requires translation from the vocabulary of a particular religious community into a generally accessible language. And I think this is relevant in this context, as when you click a little further, because we somewhat see that there are boundaries, even if they're only heuristically, but they're somewhat also in the minds and heads of people, that there is a boundary between the secular and the religious, and which might mean that, also if you click one further, there's a translation proviso between this maybe more moral knowledge that, or ethical contribution that religious actors are bringing in, and the religious concepts it's based on, to be translated into a secular language. And I want to give you 2 examples for that. If you click one further, this is of course something that you probably know quite well, but I think it's a very good example to show in which way also particularly the papal encyclica was able to translate across and reverse back to these kind of boundaries. When it was published in 2015, it received a lot of interest from religion, science, and politics. And I think you can see even 10 years after that it has actually transformed into a broader movement. We see a lot of organizations that are relating it to it now, and also the Louder to See movement even within the organization, the UNFCCC, that is presented as a movement in itself. Why it's important is that because it also for the first time showed climate change as a central focus of an encyclical, of course, and addressing socio-ecological issues, acknowledging that climate change interacts with global injustices and poverty, but also based on scientific evidence, showing that human activities are responsible for climate change. So really highlighting science-based, but also the ethical challenges that are related to climate change. And it was published at a very critical time, just a month before the UN Sustainable Development Summit, and also before the UNFCCC conference in Paris in December 2015, which was very much long awaited, and also a critical moment to finally come to an agreement between states. It's addressed to all people of goodwill, as it says in the Louder to See, and it's also there to establish dialogue with every person on this planet, as it says. It was presented in a lot of, not only in the Vatican, but to a religious community, but also major political forums, the US Congress, the UN General Assembly, and of course also in the climate conference itself. And therefore, I think it's also quite natural that it sparked a debate among environmentalists, civil society, publics, and scientists at the same time. It was interesting that there's a lot of scientific journals that picked it up. In Nature and Science, both published editorials praising the Pope's effort to reconcile science and religion. And I think the editor-in-chief of Science even wrote that Pope Francis was, quoting, our most visible champion against climate change. So that's an interesting connection, particularly, and that's also an observation from the editor of Nature, the relationship between the Catholic Church and science has long been ambivalent, as he put it. And but arguing then that that the problems motivating the Vatican are not different from those of the scientific community. Very much praising as well that the presentation was scientifically accurate, and praising the Pope as well for accepting the scientific consensus on climate change. At the same time, it was also the Pope also sought to incorporate different forms of knowledge. So he also involved scientific expertise in the writing process, of course, with the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, but also with cooperating with climate scientists at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact, for instance. The encyclical also draws on other political knowledge and cites secular documents, such as those from the UN Conference on Environment and Development from 1992, the Montreal Protocol, the Rio +20 conferences are really showing and building on the political history of agreements that we already have. And also referencing bishops' conferences from primarily from the Global South. So again, also addressing the link between climate change and global injustice, confirming that local experience-based knowledge is also essential for understanding the challenge that climate change poses to societies. So it really does not only incorporate then scientific and political knowledge, but also practical knowledge from affected communities. So not just a dialogue, if you can say, between science and religion, but also a dialogue connecting scientific expertise with more practical knowledge, I would argue. So in this sense, the Pope could really be described as a translator, bringing the secular, scientific, and together with the ethical and the religious. That is really something that has probably not been around before, because this is a way where the authority, maybe the moral authority, has been connecting with that kind of scientific authority that comes from science-based knowledge as well. What I think is interesting here as well is that it's maybe not only religious knowledge that needs translation, but the Laudato Si and the developing discussion around it also suggests that maybe scientific knowledge itself may need translation. So when decision makers and citizens do not really understand scientific facts, it might also be necessary to translate this more secular expertise actually for a non-scientific audience. And the papal encyclica, I think I would really argue, translates then in both directions. So religious knowledge and ethical questions for a broader secular audience, and at the same time also the scientific knowledge then back to a religious audience. So translator in both directions. Another example I want to give you, it comes from the climate change conferences itself. Here, there's been a lot of discussions while I've been following the events within the conferences itself and through the talks that I had with many of the religious actors that are participating. I think here we can also see a bit of a different approach to the translation proviso that Habermas is suggesting. So some religious actors, or many religious actors, often use, you can call it religious language within their communities, but they see the need to speak differently with negotiators and civil society collaborators during the climate change conferences. As an example, again, during a side event, which was called Care for Creation during one of the COPs, a representative from the Holy See spoke about the so-called operationalization of religious ideas from the papal encyclical into political activities. So he mentioned translating concepts such as human dignity, care for creation, or solidarity into a language that also speaks to others, such as the language of human rights. So that somewhat illustrates them as well that religious actors recognize the need for translation and accept also their role as translators in that context. But this, what I also found was that there were different ways how this institutional translation is interpreted and practiced by different actors. So some religious actors translate their beliefs and knowledge through imitation and differentiation from secularized international negotiation practices. So that would mean that there are actors who adapt their language and practices to the international secular environment. Somewhat imitating maybe civil society practices, and also distance themselves from, and then on the other side, those that are distancing themselves from that and trying to emphasize their distinctiveness and also their distinct contribution as religious actors. So in the first case, there are those religious actors that, you can maybe say want to be taken seriously for their expertise in scientific and technical processes. So they work very closely with those established mainstream civil society actors, such as the Climate Action Network, and by contributing, for instance, to develop frameworks for evaluating justice and equity frameworks. You also have examples like SITSE, an Association of Catholic Development Organizations, proposing concrete operationalization of the encyclical to contribute to the political debate and really say, how can we do something to change or adapt and implement the policy or the Paris Agreement. But then there are also those that are a bit more critical towards that approach. They wonder or even warn whether they may adapt too much to that kind of language. So they worry if they sound too identical to other civil society actors, that they also risk losing their very distinctive voice in the process itself and how they can contribute. So there's a bit of a variation in also how those actors act. And of course, they're not all the same. They're not a homogeneous group. They have a lot of different opinions and also ideas of how best to contribute to climate change negotiations. So they have quite different approaches when it comes to that, and also have an idea of differently engaging with those within those climate change conferences. So that would, for instance, be those that kind of use more religious symbols and language to connect to existing concepts. So the campaigns around climate pilgrimage or fast for the climate have a clear religious reference, for instance, but they can also be linked to other civil society campaigns on climate justice itself. And here it's more of a, maybe bringing up a connection through this more emotional level and to connecting political goals with hopes, fears, and faith. So there's a lot of different strategies that we can find here. Some actors also know how to adjust their language according to context. In the UNFCCC context, again, there's very often walkouts by civil society when they're unhappy about how the process has been developing. And I observed that faith actors would restrain from that before. They would say that they, although they share the concern with civil society, they want to remain in the institutional context itself. They want to remain constructive and also assert their position within the institution rather than outside of it. So also demonstrating somewhat an attempt to adapt to the secular environment without abandoning their religious identity, but bringing it really to the forefront here. So quite different way how these kind of things, how their actions have been practiced. If you have the next slide, then I'm finishing up just to bring it to a close. I think in my work, I've always been really interested and curious about this, how faith-based actors navigate between the boundaries of the religious and the secular, but also in which way they can be distinctly contributing potentially in a positive way to the climate change negotiations, and also trying to somewhat contextualize and also to complicate a little bit more this understanding that religion is just one part of broader civil society in those international institutions. And I think what I found is that they do have quite different ways of engaging, not only in terms of their underlying norms, of course, but also in which way they're practiced within the institution itself, and how they're connecting the global but also the local levels of climate change politics here in the negotiations itself. I think that was it from me. Now I've really
thank you very much.
Tour de force through many years of work.
Thank you. A real applause in presence and also a virtual one from our online audience. Thank you for this extremely lucid, informative, and complete and articulated survey of a topic that is very important to our research.